I'm Dan Haggerty. This is In Depth. As you've seen, we've been trying to answer all of your questions about the attack in Moore County on the power grid. Here's a couple of the biggies. Now that the power is restored, that was certainly a biggie. But other ones like, who did this? Well, we have no idea. How vulnerable is our power grid? Well, considering you just have to shoot it with a gun, I'd say pretty vulnerable. Like as vulnerable as, have you ever been hunting? Like a deer, if the deer never moved and you could just drive right up to it. Our governor came out on Monday, said we need to protect these substations, that we need to, quote, harden the targets, to which most people probably thought, I didn't realize they were this soft. I mean, who knew that bullets could do this much damage to an entire power grid? And apparently, the power companies knew. In fact, they were warned about it pretty specifically years ago from the Department of Homeland Security. I Googled it for like 2 seconds and found this story. Attacks on U.S. power grid have been the subject of extremist chatter for years. DHS Bulletin warns of attacks. Listen to this. They cite a 14-page document of chat logs that say things like, quote, the power grid would be crippled for a very large area. Armor-piercing rounds shot into the transformers would destroy them. Wow, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Also, you may not remember this, power company people do. Back in 2013, a sniper attacked a California power station, raised fears of terrorism. That was a decade ago. And a crime, by the way, that is still unsolved for anybody holding their breath, waiting for that news of an arrest to come out of Moore County. It's all quite concerning. We knew it was possible and how it could be done. We knew how damaging it could be and how dangerous it could be for entire communities filled with families. And it begs the question, what does all of this have to do with drag? Let's go in depth. And I'll start with this, and it's something I'm sure you've heard. The sheriff has said multiple times that there is no provable connection between the power grid attack and the controversial drag show that same night. So considering that the sheriff has said that multiple times, why is the media so focused on it? Why do we keep talking about it? Because we're sensational? Because of our leftist narrative that sympathizes with the LGBTQ community and ignores some faith-based people? Are you nodding? Are you going, yeah, just hear me out? You see, when the drag show was first announced weeks ago, the organizers reported getting death threats, and it made the news, like it would, right? We reported the drag show ramped up security because of the backlash. You see, at the time, it had only been a week since the tragedy in Colorado, where a man opened fire on a club full of strangers, killing 5 people and injuring 22 more on a night where they were celebrating drag and the birthday of a performer. Now, look, when these sorts of things kind of happen together and the media starts covering it and social media starts buzzing about it, people get all riled up. And that's exactly what happened. In Southern Pines, protesters started rallying and calling for prayer, and counter-protesters started protesting the protesters. No, it was peaceful, signs and chanting and that sort of thing, but it also got heated and angry, and let's not forget about the death threats that came before it. Then, just as the show was getting underway on Saturday, the attack happened. Someone shot the power grid, and that blackout spread across the county, and one of the organizers of the drag protest posted this to Facebook. The power is out in Moore County, and I know why, which sent up some red flags. Makes sense, doesn't it? People got curious. People like the sheriff and the governor and the FBI and the 100,000 people trying to figure out what to do with all the food in their fridge. So investigators went to her house. They questioned her, and she told them that God did it, that God will not be mocked, and knocked out the power to stop the drag show. Feels like to me that's a bit of a broad brush for God, but apparently investigators agreed. And it turns out he's not on the suspect list. Instead, they're looking for people. And the drag show is a pretty good place to start, considering that just 3 days earlier, the Department of Homeland Security put out this bulletin warning of domestic terrorism, saying, lone offenders and small groups motivated by a range of ideological beliefs and/or personal grievances continue to pose a persistent and lethal threat to the homeland. Targets of potential violence include public gatherings, faith-based institutions, the LGBTQI+ community, schools, racial and religious minorities, government facilities and personnel, U.S. critical infrastructure, the media, and perceived ideological opponents. So that's why the drag show is such a big part of this story, since potentially this attack checks a few things off that list, doesn't it? But you might be saying, Dan, why aren't we talking about the other things on that list? The potential targets. Schools, for instance, they're closed, right? Or churches, or any other public gathering that's been planned this entire week. And you'd be right, of course. But considering that just this weekend, the same weekend as the attack here, people in Florida protested a drag event by waving a Nazi flag and wearing Nazi insignia. In Ohio, protesters opposed a drag event there dressed like they were going to war with rifles and camo and helmets. 2 weeks ago, GLAAD published a list of 124 protests, threats, and attacks on drag events in the U.S. this year. The top 2 states were Texas and us, at 10 apiece. And considering Texas has 3 times the population of North Carolina, that's why the drag event is part of this story, whether it ends up being directly connected or not, which is something we may never know if the crime remains unsolved. Let me know what you think. I want to hear your thoughts on this. What questions do you have? Opinions on this story or how we've been covering it? Email me at dan@wral.com or find me on social media. Give me your thoughts and we'll go in depth.